Okay, so let's unpack this. When we talk about the Viking Age, the first image that usually comes to mind is, the fearsome raid.
Right. The dragon-headed longship arriving from the fog, all fire and steel.
Exactly. But that narrative, that simple story of the barbarian raider, it only tells what, half the story? Maybe less.
Oh, much less. The critical piece, the one that sustained, 3 centuries of global movement, conquest, and exploration, was the incredibly sophisticated economic machine underneath it all.
A brutal one, a lot of the time.
A brutal one, for sure. If you only focus on the plunder, you miss the engineering, the supply chains, and, frankly, the meticulous financial strategy required to organize and maintain these expeditions.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to connect the dots for you. How did a largely rural, decentralized society manage to invent a global trade network?
And a wealth accumulation system that, at its peak, really did rival early medieval Europe. And the most basic question of all, what was their actual currency?
Right. We're going to trace the full economic life cycle for you. We'll start right on the floor of a smoky longhouse and stretch all the way to these vast, risky trade routes they pioneered.
Routes that went deep into Asia and even across the Atlantic. It's fascinating because you have these distinct economic layers from, harsh, self-sufficient farming to a complex international bullion system.
And they all supported each other.
They absolutely did. To understand the global Viking, you first have to understand the farmer, because the stability of that rural backbone sustained everything else.
So let's start right there, at that foundation, the microeconomy of the Viking home.
Yes. We talk about these big trade hubs like Hedeby, but we have to remember the vast majority of people, probably 90%, were not urban traders or warriors.
They were farmers.
They were farmers living in these small, quiet villages, often just 6 or 7 farms clustered together.
That's the reality check, isn't it? If you picture a typical community of maybe, 250 people, their entire world is focused on resource management in a pretty small area.
Exactly. And the Longhouse was the absolute epicenter of this microeconomy.
It wasn't just a shelter. I mean, from the descriptions, it was a factory, a storehouse, a community center, all in one.
And there were huge structures built with those distinctive bowed walls, almost giving them a ship-like outline.
Right, with the 2 rows of internal posts running down the center, holding up the roof.
And this is a key detail that shows you how integrated their life and their capital were. During the brutal Scandinavian winters, the animals,
Their wealth.
their literal physical wealth, were often housed in stalls built right at one end of the longhouse.
That sounds incredibly practical. Maybe. Not pleasant, but practical. You're protecting your livestock from the cold and from thieves, and you get their body heat.
Precisely. It's a very sophisticated system of thermal efficiency,
Yeah.
but it came with significant costs, social and health costs.
Let's talk about the conditions inside. It was just a central fireplace, right? No chimney.
Just an oblong central fire for cooking and heat, and the smoke just escaped through a hole in the roof. No windows, no proper ventilation.
The sources suggest this was, catastrophic for long-term health.
It was brutal. Archaeological studies show the smoke levels in these longhouses were comparable to the intense indoor smoke from open cooking fires you still find in some rural communities today.
Wow.
And this constant exposure meant that respiratory diseases, lung diseases, they were common, especially among women and children who spent the most time inside.
That immediately challenges that image of the uniformly robust, healthy Viking.
It does. Their constant struggle wasn't just against enemies, it was against the very air they breathed in their own homes.
So that really brings it home. Let's turn to wealth itself. You said economic capital. In this early rural world, how was wealth actually quantified?
Well, it wasn't land, which was abundant, and it wasn't silver yet. It was cattle. The number of livestock you owned.
Cattle were everything.
Everything. Milk, meat, leather, labor. They were your currency, your food security, and your status all rolled into one.
So that hypothetical 250-person village,
Hmm.
the sheer number of animals needed to keep that running must have been astonishing.
The ratios are intense. You might expect around 400 sheep, 300 cattle, 200 pigs, 100 goats.
That's about 4 major animals per person.
Roughly, yeah. Plus chickens, cats, dogs. Managing that was a massive logistical exercise. You had to feed and shelter them all through the winter.
And yet, despite all these animals, we have evidence of, endemic food insecurity. How does a society with 4 animals per person still go hungry?
It just highlights the razor-thin margin they were operating on. Periodic, severe food shortages were common.
A bad winter, a disease outbreak in the herd.
Exactly. A crop failure. And the sources suggest almost everyone experienced periods of scarcity and hunger in their youth.
Which would have developmental consequences.
Huge ones. A significant portion of the population likely had physical or cognitive issues from malnutrition during their formative years. It really contrasts with this idea of Viking expansion being fueled by armies of perfectly well-fed warriors.
The pressure was just constant. So that brings us to the working year. How much room was there for anyone to specialize in a craft?
Very, very little at first. Most people were generalists. You had to know a bit of everything. Carpentry, farming, basic metalworking.
Everyone did everything.
Pretty much. In that 250-person community, you might find a handful of true artisans, maybe 2 to 10 people. And even then, their workshop was probably just an outbuilding on the farm.
So the labor cycle was rigid. It was dictated entirely by the seasons.
Completely. Let's walk through it, because it explains why any other activity like raiding had to be squeezed into very specific windows.
Okay, so spring.
Spring was recovery and prep. It was often the hungry time because winter stores were low. So you're cutting wood, you're repairing boats and buildings, tarring the ships for the sea, sewing sails.
Planting fields, shearing sheep. A huge amount of work.
A massive amount. Then summer was the peak season for everything.
Right, for agriculture, but also for external activities.
Exactly. This was the window for long-distance sailing, for trade, for raiding. At home, women were intensely focused on spinning wool and weaving the heavy winter clothes.
It was also the social season.
Yeah, the time for assemblies, the things, forging political links, arranging marriages.
And autumn was the moment of truth. The big push.
The harvest climax, the last salmon run for protein. You bring the animals down from the high summer pastures.
Which they called sheelings.
Sheelings, or mountain pastures, yeah. This is when you're making cheese, culling the herds, the animals you can't afford to feed over winter, and preserving all that meat. It's a race against the frost.
And then winter, the downtime, if you can call it that.
It was domestic time. Family bonding, teaching kids, repairing tools, storytelling, cutting the massive amounts of timber you'd need for the next year, or maybe some ice fishing.
You mentioned local production, and wood was second only to agriculture.
Oh, woodworking and lumbering were economic superpowers. They used wood for everything. Houses, ships, tools, plates, bowls. But here's a surprising detail about their craft.
Okay.
Pottery was actually very rare in Scandinavia.
Really? So what did they eat off of? They needed bowls.
They did. But instead of a potter, you were far more likely to find a specific type of artisan called a bodger,
A bodger.
a green woodworker. Using a simple tool called a pole lathe, the bodger would carve dishes, cups, and trays from fresh green wood.
So they weren't making pretty ceramics. They were making wooden utility ware.
Exactly. It's an example of extreme pragmatism just driven by what resources were available locally.
So the foundation is this rigorous, smoky, intensive farmstead. It's self-sufficient for survival, but to get the massive wealth needed for conquest, they needed a liquid external currency.
And that brings us perfectly to silver. That's the perfect transition. We're now shifting from the scarcity of the farm to the international market, and that market was funded entirely by silver.
This is where we have to throw out the Hollywood image of Vikings hoarding chests of gold coins.
Right. Gold was extremely rare. It was mostly for high-status jewelry, status symbols. Silver was the undisputed monetary commodity in Western Europe during the Viking Age.
And when you hear about things like the Danegeld, the massive tribute paid to the Danes to stop raiding, it's always recorded in pounds of silver, not gold.
Always. Which emphasizes just how fundamental silver was as the medium of exchange.
And the genius of their system was that they didn't care where the silver came from. They just cared about its weight.
Precisely. The economy relied entirely on the weight and the purity of the silver. They'd trade using foreign coins, Anglo-Saxon pennies, Arab dirhams, but the number of coins was irrelevant. You weighed the total amount.
It was a necessary innovation because they didn't have a standardized central mint for most of this period.
Exactly. If you want to trade on a large, cross-cultural scale, weight is the only universal standard.
So where was all this silver coming from? Not from Scandinavia itself.
No, the overwhelming majority of it flowed from the east. It came from the rich, abased silver mines in Central Asia.
All the way from Central Asia.
All the way. And that reliance on a distant foreign source is a critical vulnerability that we'll come back to later.
So let's connect this directly to raiding. If silver is the currency, then raiding Western Europe is no longer just random violence. It becomes an economic strategy.
It's a shortcut to liquidity, as you'd call it today. Raiding was a way to violently extract hard currency from a richer region. And that silver was immediately fungible.
Meaning you could use it for anything as soon as you got it home.
Yes. It was quickly melted down, cut into usable pieces, and traded locally for essential goods: furs, honey, ore. The most valuable and tragic export of the era, enslaved people.
It created a powerful but very unstable economy. It was dependent on constantly extracting wealth from somewhere else.
It was. But a system based on foreign coins and violent extraction sounds chaotic, right? Prone to fraud.
Which is why we have to talk about hack silver. This, I think, is one of the most brilliant pieces of Viking economic technology.
Hack silver, literally cut silver, was their answer to the need for a small change in standardization.
It's just fragments of anything silver. Cut up church plates, bent jewelry, broken ingots.
Pieces of foreign coins. It was their decentralized cash machine, their way of making change.
Yeah.
If you needed to pay exactly 3.7 grams of silver, you just chopped off 3.7 grams of something.
And we have archaeological proof of this everywhere. The Cordale Hoard in England, for instance.
With 8,600 coins mixed with hundreds of pieces of hack silver, the coins were just raw material to be cut and weighed.
Okay, but this introduces a huge risk. Purity. How did the average trader know they weren't being handed a piece of lead coated in silver?
That is the critical question. Trust was managed through vigilance and essential equipment. Every serious trader needed two things: scales and weights.
And we find these, right? These little folding scales.
We do. Beautifully decorated, yet perfectly functional, folding scales and standardized weights like the ones from the Isle of Gia. They were absolutely necessary.
So the scales are your first line of defense. What about checking the purity of the metal itself?
They had simple field tests. The most common was the acoustic test. You'd rub coins together or drop them on a hard surface to listen for a pure, bell-like ring.
A low-grade alloy would just make a dull thud.
A dull, impure sound, yeah. But the ultimate verification was often destructive. You'd use a small knife to scrape the surface to make sure the silver went all the way through.
And this liquid nature of silver connects directly to a warrior status. The story about the silver bracelet is a perfect example.
It's the ultimate symbol of liquidity and status. A wealthy warrior wore his fortune on his arm. A big, heavy silver bracelet. If he needed to buy something, he could literally take his axe, chop a piece off, weigh it, and pay.
His status symbol was his emergency checking account.
Exactly. That is a fundamentally different and much more physical relationship with money than we have today.
Okay, so the moment this silver enters Scandinavia, it doesn't just sit there. It fuels this massive interconnected global operation. Now we have to zoom out to the macroeconomy.
The structure of their vast trade networks, and they were engineered around a few strategic choke points.
These were the three great hubs,
Mm-hmm.
and they were essential for the decentralized Viking world to interface with centralized powers.
Like the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Abbasids, and most importantly, they allowed the emerging Viking kings to control commerce and collect taxes.
Let's start with Hedeby in Denmark. What made it such a powerhouse?
Hedeby, founded around 810, was all about location, location, location. It was at the narrowest point of the peninsula, the crucial junction between Scandinavia and Western Europe.
It controlled the flow of goods into and out of the Baltic.
By monopolizing that route, the Danish king Godfred was able to exert massive economic influence and pull in huge revenues from taxes and tolls. Hedeby was basically a cash cow funding the Danish kingdom.
Then moving east, you have Birka in Sweden. That was the gateway to the silver source.
Birka was absolutely critical for that eastern flow of wealth. It was founded even earlier in the 700s, and it seems like it was state-controlled from the very beginning.
And it was an all-year-round port, even in winter.
Right, which was unusual. It was the key transfer point for goods coming via the island of Gotland, funneling that precious Abbasid silver deep into Scandinavia.
And finally, Kaupang in Norway.
Kaupang, on the Oslo fjord, specialized in exporting specific northern products. Walrus teeth ivory whetstones for sharpening tools, furs, and soapstone vessels.
But it faced more competition.
A lot more. Norwegian traders often found it more lucrative to just sail to the British Isles, especially Dublin. So Kaupang never reached the same dominance as Hedeby or Birka.
So what was actually moving through these centers? What were the big-ticket items generating the wealth to fund these armies?
Well, the exports that created the economic bridge between North and East were primarily furs and significantly enslaved persons.
I can't understate that.
No, these were the highest value, high volume exports. They were absolutely central to the Viking commercial system, connecting them to markets in Byzantium and the caliphates.
And beyond those, darker commodities, what specialized goods did they export?
They specialized in high-utility goods. Iron ore from inland Sweden was a huge revenue source. And those soapstone vessels we
They
mentioned,
were heavy, though.
incredibly heavy, 5 or 6 kilos each, making them costly to transport, yet they were traded widely. It shows there was a huge demand for durable, fireproof kitchenware.
And what were they dependent on imports for? This is key to why they couldn't just be self-sufficient.
Their dependence on foreign trade was profound. They imported luxuries, sure, fine cloth, glass, wine, but the crucial dependencies were on raw materials:
Like what?
copper, tin, and lead.
Why were those so vital?
They were foundational. You need copper and tin to make bronze for jewelry and high-quality castings. Lead was critical for making weights for those essential scales and for shipbuilding. The domestic metalworking industry just couldn't function without those international supply chains.
Which means their trade routes had to be massive. This is a truly global reach.
The eastern routes were existential. Using the Volga and Dnieper rivers, they connected Scandinavia through Eastern Europe down to the Caspian and Black Seas. That linked them to Constantinople and, crucially, to Baghdad, the source of all that silver.
Without that route, the whole system collapses.
The whole bullion system just seizes up.
Meanwhile, in the West, it wasn't just raiding. They were deeply integrated.
They established strong diplomatic and trade relationships with the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and you have their military service for the Byzantine emperors as the famous Varangian Guard.
They were placing themselves inside the power structures of the two greatest empires of the day.
Exactly. It was a strategic move far beyond simple aggression.
And we have this incredible outside perspective from the Arabic trader Al-Tartushi. He visited Hedeby in the 900s.
His account is gold. He called Hedeby a great city, so he recognized its importance. But coming from the Abbasid world, he was profoundly disappointed.
Underwhelmed.
Completely. He found it lacking in luxury goods and wealth compared to global standards. It was a thriving market for the Nordic world, but still rough and peripheral compared to Baghdad.
And his cultural critique is just.
It's amazing.
It's fantastic cultural evidence. He was shocked that women had the right to divorce and that both men and women wore makeup. But his description of their singing is unforgettable. What did he say?
He called it a rumbling sound coming from their throat, as if like a dog, only far more bestial.
Wow.
It just paints this picture of a successful but rough utilitarian trading hub, a world away from the courtly culture of the Islamic world.
All the trade we've discussed, all the expansion, it all hinged on one piece of unparalleled tech.
Ah.
The longship. Yet modern recreations show just how high risk this technology actually was.
Viking shipbuilders were absolute masters, but experimental archaeology, like the reconstruction of the ship Draken, confirms the inherent fragility that came with their speed and flexibility.
Okay, so let's get technical for a second. The unique flexibility comes from its clinker construction.
That's the key. The hull planks overlap, clinker style, instead of being laid flush. This creates a hull that's light and incredibly flexible. It can twist and ride over heavy waves rather than snapping.
But the Draken reconstruction proved that flexibility was also a massive vulnerability.
It was a trade-off. Because the hull flexed so much, the keel nails holding it all together were prone to shearing off. That's catastrophic failure mid-ocean.
So constant rebuilding and repair was just part of the process.
It was the normal industrial process. And it suggests an awful lot of ships probably just went down.
Yet they had this incredible, almost counterintuitive maritime wisdom.
Take the ballasting system. They used about 21 tons of loose grapefruit-sized stones, not fixed ballast.
Why?
The genius is that if the ship capsized, the heavy stones would immediately spill out. That massive weight loss would then let the buoyant wooden hull float, giving the crew a chance to survive.
That's brilliant. A built-in safety measure.
And they paired this material engineering with a reliance on the intangible, on magic.
The dragon heads on the bow, they weren't just for show.
Not at all. Based on the sagas, they were believed to be magical protection, to scare away enemies and ensure a safe voyage. Runes were also carved into timbers for safety and courage. It was all part of their risk management strategy.
And this superior high-risk tech allowed them to turn resource extraction into a global investment strategy, especially across the North Atlantic. What commodity fueled that expansion?
Walrus ivory. If oil is the high-value commodity of our age, walrus ivory was the oil of the high medieval period. The demand for it in Europe was staggering.
For chess pieces, religious relics.
Ornate boxes. That demand drove the Viking expansion into Iceland and Greenland. It was a commercial imperative, much more than a search for new farmland.
And the research shows they went to genuinely extreme lengths to get it.
DNA analysis of ancient walrus tusks is crucial here. It proves most of the ivory did not come from right next to the Greenland settlements. It came from remote hunting grounds deep in the high Arctic.
So they were sailing hundreds of kilometers north into ice-filled waters, purely driven by market demand.
Purely. Which suggests they almost certainly encountered and traded with the Thule Inuit and other indigenous Arctic peoples.
An exchange driven by the high-value demand for furs and ivory back in Europe.
It had to be. And of course, that same maritime capability allowed them to prove the legend of Vinland was real.
The settlement at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland. Unequivocal proof they reached North America 500 years before Columbus.
But the evidence goes deeper than just a landfall. It suggests targeted, resource-driven exploration.
What's the concrete proof of that?
It's the flora. Archaeologists found butternut, both the nuts and the wood, at the site.
And butternut trees don't grow in northern Newfoundland.
No, nor do the wild grapes from the Vinland sagas. The nearest source is over 800 kilometers south, in places like New Brunswick. This proves they were conducting deep reconnaissance and resource extraction missions down the coast and returning. It was commercial exploration.
Okay, so we've established the foundation. The rural stability, the silver, the global trade, the high-tech ships. Now we have to connect how all this wealth translated into centralized power and military strength.
And ultimately, what caused this powerful machine to finally seize up?
The rise of kings was directly linked to controlling commerce.
Absolutely. The founding of a major trade town like Hedeby was basically a massive state revenue project, a mechanism to institutionalize taxation. King Godfred's entire motivation was financial extraction.
So the tax profits were the state budget. And what was the #9 government spending priority?
Military capacity. The money was used to recruit professional warriors and to fund the industrial process of building and maintaining the great Viking fleet.
And these finance armies, in turn, funded the large-scale military conquests, like in England. The tax system was the lifeblood of expansion.
It was, and this financial model also shaped the social structure, particularly the role of the regional chieftain, the jarl. Their authority was inherently economic.
It was transactional.
Entirely. Chieftains needed a constant supply of silver from trade and raids to reward their followers. It created a feedback loop. Silver buys loyalty. Loyalty gets you more men for expeditions. Expeditions get you more silver.
Without that constant influx of cash, the jarl's authority would just evaporate.
It would. And this pressure, especially around succession, created a unique political strategy.
The surplus son strategy.
Yes. If a jarl had multiple sons, rather than let them fight for the home territory and risk civil war, he'd equip a surplus son with a ship and men and send him off Viking.
The goal being for him to establish a new jarldom somewhere else, in England, Ireland, Russia.
It was an ingenious way to export domestic political conflict while expanding the family's overall economic sphere.
Before we get to the collapse, we have to touch on how our understanding of the hierarchy is changing, particularly with gender roles.
Right. The traditional view of rigidly defined roles is being significantly challenged. The high-status warrior grave found at Birka is a perfect example.
It was filled with weapons, looked like a commander's grave.
And DNA analysis proved definitively that the person buried there was a woman. That just shattered the old preconceptions.
What are the economic implications of that? If a woman could hold military command, did she also hold parallel economic power? In trade, land ownership?
That is the essential question now. If a woman could command the wealth and manpower represented by that grave, it implies a level of economic agency and resource control far greater than we previously assumed.
So this machine was robust, global, and adaptable. Why did it collapse? A system that thrived on risk eventually hit its limit.
It did. The collapse was due to a perfect storm of 3 interconnected pressures happening almost at once.
Okay, so what was the first shock to the system?
The external one. The fatal blow. The eastern trade routes collapsed.
The silver faucet was turned off.
It was. Geopolitical instability around the Caspian Sea made the vital arteries carrying a base silver unsafe and unreliable. The source of their bullion just dried up.
At the same time, they were draining their own home economies.
That was the self-inflicted wound. Massive capital flight. Instead of raiders returning to Scandinavia with their plunder, Vikings started settling permanently in the lands they conquered.
In Normandy, England, Russia.
Right, and that drained both the human capital, the jarls and their warriors, and the financial resources that should have been recycled back into the home economy.
And finally, the kings panicked.
They did, and they attacked their own centers of wealth. As the silver dried up and capital fled, the kings, desperate for revenue, made a fatal miscalculation. They drastically raised domestic trade taxes.
Why was that the last straw?
It was completely counterproductive. It drove away the remaining merchants. Faced with high tariffs and dwindling silver, traders just left. They sought more stable and lucrative opportunities, mostly south in Europe.
And as the merchants left,
The entire economic engine, the trade revenues, the liquid capital, the tax base that had funded the great armies, it all just sputtered out. The age of Viking expansion was effectively over.
so what does this all mean when we look back? The Viking Age was never just about the fury of the raid. That was just the symptom of a highly organized economic ambition.
It was a centuries-long, risk-based economic strategy, built on the fragile foundation of intensive agriculture livestock and wood, and supported by a brilliant, decentralized, weight-based currency system.
Axover, which made global cross-cultural trade possible without a central bank or a unified kingdom.
And this raises a truly profound question. We've seen their expansion was fueled by this high-value, high-risk trade, navigating into the high Arctic for walrus ivory, sailing 800 kilometers just to harvest a specific type of timber.
Right.
Given how inherently fragile their technology and economic systems were, constantly needing to be rebuilt, dependent on political stability in places as far away as Baghdad, how did they manage the sheer logistics and risk to sustain this sprawling, aggressive global operation for nearly 300 years? That level of enduring ambition is just extraordinary.
It really is a testament to commercial ingenuity. But here's a provocative thought for you to carry forward as you think about this era. Given the economic realities, that their primary measure of wealth was livestock, and that two of their most profitable early exports were enslaved people and furs, does the modern Viking brand, which focuses solely on exploration and martial prowess, fully capture the brutal, yet brilliantly ingenious commercial realities of their age? They fundamentally transformed European politics and trade. Yet the image of the simple barbarian persists, obscuring the ruthless complexity of the Viking economic machine.